Welcome to the Mavens of Marketing, a weekly podcast hosted by me, Rachel Durkin.
And me, Kerry Barrett. We talk all things marketing, innovation, sales, and business growth strategies, and the standard tried and true marketing techniques.
Come for the conversation, stay for the savvy insights.
And the borderline inappropriate jokes. I'm Kerry Barrett. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Mavens of Marketing. And I am joined, as always, by the lovely Rachel Durkin. How are you, my friend?
I'm holding it together today.
You are? You're doing better than me then.
Yeah, no, I'm doing fantastic. I'm really excited for this interview. My children have left the house. We are in good shape. It's going to be a great day.
And let's introduce our audience to the also lovely Ryan Wieland. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you guys for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
We are so excited to talk to you. And actually, your area of specialty and what you're talking about today is something that I've been thinking a lot about in the age of COVID, what that means, how people access our websites, and, there's a lot to get to, but why don't you introduce yourself to our audience so they know who you are and why you are the person to talk to when it comes to ADA compliance?
Well, I appreciate that. Ringing endorsements, I have to live up to it here through this interview. No, as Kerry said, my name is Ryan Wieland. I've been here at Accessible360. So that's our organization for almost 4 years now. So I've been in the accessibility space for quite some time at this point. And here at A360, we focus 100% of our efforts on just that, digital accessibility, helping organizations, large, small, really in every single industry vertical globally as well. So this isn't just a US thing. We work with brands really across the globe on providing equitable access in the digital environment. I think it's historically something that's much easier to, and I don't know if this is the right word for it, but to see when it was physical accessibility. So historical ADA, we go to a location, we see a ramp, it's obvious why that's there. I think in the digital environment, it's a little bit more difficult for people to perceive the fact that people with disabilities still consume just like those of us that don't have a disability, and the really critical importance to that. And I think you nailed it. COVID really put a heightened importance on this. People couldn't go to a lot of locations, especially that population, high-risk population. All of a sudden, they were consuming everything digitally, and in many places, they were being blocked out from equitable access.
So let me ask you this. When you are a small business owner, or let's say someone is starting out in business and they're beginning to build their website, or they have a website and they're updating it, oftentimes, unfortunately, ADA compliance is like the last thing that they think of, but regretting to think about it and not implementing a strategy and making sure that your site is compliant is a huge no-no, and the ramifications can be massive. Yes?
Yes, absolutely. I think, especially from a small business perspective, I think it's a big challenge in that it's hard enough to get a website live, go through the cycles of that, the resources to do that. But you're exactly right. Putting equitable access in, WCAG compliance or ADA compliance on the back burner is definitely a no-no, in the sense of you could have someone who's trying to engage with your brand and they simply can't because they cannot access it. They can't do anything on your site. And then obviously, as we'll probably get into, the legal ramifications of that, and the fact that I'd love to tell you there aren't plaintiff firms out there filing lawsuits left and right, but there are, and they're attacking everybody and anybody. So, the biggest thing I say to a small business, I think that's such a phenomenal question, is really just have a good a good amount of networking available to you. Even if you're not engaging with someone like A360, we're happy to talk to you. We're happy to help with resources and even just talk about best practices and, have those resources from an expertise perspective to at least get you on the right path. Because many times it's not something maybe you implement from day one, but maybe you roll that in over the course of, 6, 12, 18 months. And there's different ways to approach accessibility, different tactics to approach accessibility. So, I would say leverage your network. Don't try to tackle this by yourself, because you could get into a tricky solution or path, so to speak.
So Ryan, just so the audience is kind of aware. So Let's talk for a second about, and this could go down a rabbit hole or a couple rabbit holes, the motivations of why US companies, because I know Europe's a whole different animal, are being accessible. Now, Ryan and I, just to clarify, kind of like Accessible 360, and Ryan, please correct me if I'm wrong, because it's just how I know you guys. But we'll do a lot of web development for clients, and we bring Ryan's team in to confirm that we're accessible. And I want you, Ryan, to talk about in just a second how you guys work and how what you do holds up in court, and the importance of that. But before we get there, just to give you an example, the two reasons that I've seen clients come to us with an accessibility requirement, because it's not necessarily the cheapest thing in the world, and it's not going to get, well, I shouldn't say it's not going to get a direct ROI. In some cases it will. One, quite a few nonprofits and organizations we work with that serve people with accessibility disadvantages come to us because there's a market there, and I'm sure you can talk about that, Ryan. And they want to serve their audience appropriately. And then two, we've had clients come to us and say, we've been sued. The court says we have X number of days to become accessible. We got to do it. And every time I hear that, I mean, every time I hear it in general, I talk to Ryan. But when I hear that, there's a lot of people or tools out there that say they can help you become accessible, and they really won't hold up in the court of law, and they won't hold up in the day-to-day environment. So just, that's a lot. I'm setting you up for, Ryan, but take it away from there.
Don't forget any of it.
Don't forget any of it. All right.
Yeah. So I love it. That's definitely a rabbit hole question and a broad question. So let me try to break that down, and then you guys steer me back on a straight and narrow path if I get off on a tangent.
You're asking.
So motivation.
I'll try.
Motivations. Let's start there, because I think, Rachel, that's a good part of the question. So I think this is broken down into really about 5 quadrants today, but I'll focus on, really the first quadrant, which is the heaviest one, and that is legal action. So either in 2 facets, you either have someone who is legally targeted, so they received a demand letter, a lawsuit, either in federal court under the ADA or in civil rights state courts. That's one of the biggest trends we saw in 2020 was places like California under the Civil Rights Act. These plaintiff firms going out there and filing lawsuits in those places as well. So that's obviously the immediate, hair on fire, reach out to A360, reach out to your web development team to fix or understand the fact that you do have a lawsuit or a demand letter facing your organization. That is the mechanism where a lot of people start to engage and think about accessibility. So that's sort of quadrant 1, and in quadrant 2 is sort of along those lines in the sense of you saw your biggest competitor get targeted. You're reading all these articles on your industry being targeted. And so you have this fear of legal action, or sort of the fact that, I hear this daily from organizations, we're a sitting duck. If we don't do this, we know we are going to get legally targeted. So in a way, those two are both very directly related to the legal aspect. Where A360 steps in to help on that front is the fact that, I'll just say it bluntly and plainly, because I think that's important for the audience. We do strongly believe that a lot of these plaintiff firms we've proven and know that a lot of these plaintiff firms are absolutely ambulance chasers. Their intentions are not good. They don't, at the end of the day, care about accessibility, which sounds crazy, but they've almost turned this into leveraging the ADA, leveraging the civil rights laws in various states into a business model. They provide copy and paste lawsuits. I mean, we see some weeks where an industry vertical, like let's take e-commerce, for example, all of these competitors within e-commerce are targeted by the same plaintiff, and those lawsuits all look literally copy and paste. They changed the organization name and the URL. That's not a good tactic from our perspective. So where A360 jumps in, and where we have stood for really since day one, and one of our founding mechanisms was we are not going to engage with the plaintiff firms. We have never worked with the plaintiff firm. We have never talked with the plaintiff firm. I can say that pointedly and publicly, because that's one of our longstanding beliefs. We have only supported on the defense side. In fact, we, to my knowledge, are the only accessibility company that has ever gone to court on defense of our client. And we did see a win in that court case in 2019. So our longstanding belief is, one, we want to help you with the right mechanism for achieving equitable access, achieving WCAG compliance, but also understanding that legal and compliance is a very critical part of this. We provide litigation support for most of the top ADA defense attorneys across the nation. We work with internal and external counsel on a daily basis for both new clients and existing clients, when these ambulance chasers file those lawsuits, A360 comes in. We do things like affidavit of accessibility activities. We do expert rebuttals where we are putting someone who is actually living with these disabilities. So getting into, again, down a rabbit hole, down a tangent of sort of who we are, what we represent. About half of our auditing staff does live with full blindness. They are legally blind. They require a native screen reader to navigate the internet. So we strategically are set up to have those individuals come in and answer those claims. Point out that many of those claims on many of these lawsuits, even though they file claims saying it was for someone who uses a native screen reader, either JAWS or NVDA in all of these cases, having one of our senior blind auditors go in and say, that's great, but of these 20 claims, 10 of them aren't even for someone who is blind. So that's where we start to get into the mechanisms of what they're doing and the tactics they're taking. I
just want to preface this point here, and Ryan, you're talking really fast because you have so much good information. So I just want to make sure we're catching this point that you're saying. But one of the reasons that I love working with Accessible360 is because you can use these free tools that are Lead tool or out there that'll say whether your website's accessible or not. What's really cool about A360 is that you guys actually have people with disabilities on staff who use and play with, edit, audit, whatever, the sites. And then if my company were to get sued, one of those people will go to court and say, no, I checked the site on March 15th.
Yeah.
It was working. And that's how you're going to make sure that my compliance holds up in the court of law, right? Just to be clear on that.
Yeah, so great point. So yeah, I'll dive into our services and tactics after that. The one thing I just want to clarify, because I think it's a great point, is many times these things do settle out of court. I think there's been 2 cases ever that have gone to court. A360 supported on one of them, and we did put a blind auditor on stand, and that was a critical point in that team winning and proving that the site was accessible. But you're exactly right. Many times we actually can support clients within a 48-hour window. We want to provide litigation support. We want to hopefully get those cases ruled on mootness before they even ever go to court, before they ever have to engage with the plaintiff firm. Because the reality is many times court is too expensive for clients. So and actually easier to engage A360 and settle outside of court and settle down to a very, very low amount, or just, again, rule the case, get it thrown out on mootness based on us showing someone living with a disability can engage with their site, can engage with their brand, and the fact that those claims are false and very pointedly do that. And we have many tactics that we take to do that. So yeah, I think that's a great point, Rachel. And then I think the other point of that is, let's dive into how we audit, what we do, what we believe in. And that is, the way that we lead to client success is certainly not me. I don't have any say in that, to be honest. I won't try to take credit for that. It's the amazing individuals behind me, not physically behind me, but behind me here at A360.
Your exercise. Is it your exercise bike?
Yeah, they're living in the exercise bike. No.
I know, when's the last time you were actually on that thing?
Last night. So I actually, about 3 to 4 times a week I use it. So that was sort of our COVID purchase as a family.
I love
and
it.
It's been great. It's been great for me.
I got you a little bit off track there. Okay, go ahead.
No, great question. Way to keep me honest. So really the way that we do that, the way we drive client success is with humans. As you so explicitly said, Rachel, we are not going to sell you on the fact that some little widget is going to fix thousands of lines of code. We're not going to sell you on the fact that, hey, just use a scanning tool, either free or paid, and that's magically going to fix your accessibility issues. Here's the reality. Scanning tools as they stand today, so automation tools, I'm not trying to say they're not great. I'm not trying to say they're not a bad place to start, because it's better than doing nothing.
A bad place to start. The reason I say that is because I get clients, people come to me first for a website and they're like, we want to be ADA accessible. I get the same challenge with SEO, and they think that if they just run it through this tool and we do that, then they're going to be accessible. And I always have to educate them that if somebody's telling them that, they're uninformed or lying.
Right.
Because it will not hold up. It will not make you accessible. I've used this term before with SEO. It's kind of like being a little bit pregnant. Either you're accessible or you're not accessible. There's no in between. So I feel really passionate about that, but I'll let you keep going, Ryan, on how you make sure you're accessible. But I'm very blunt about my opinion on that, and that's fine.
No, I love it. And I have a great example to piggyback on that in a few seconds here. So But you're exactly right. So automation tools, as they stand today, can find, let's just call it roughly a third of issues. So they can check for about a third of accessibility issues. Oh,
You
go
run
ahead.
it through, it catches 33%. There's another close to 67 that's just sort of out there, and hopefully nobody stumbles across them.
Precisely, and that's just it. And actually, it's kind of interesting. So that's where, Kerry, to your point, that's why we use human testing. So we do everything from a live user perspective. We do everything from the sense of putting human auditors. So the way that we actually do that, ironically, or maybe not ironically, to ensure we're providing full and equitable access, is we actually pair a blind auditor on every single audit that we do. So we put someone who is a native screen reader user, does live with full blindness. They use JAWS or NVDA for everything they do, to check their email, to use Microsoft Word, to use Slack, to engage with the internet. So it is someone who is legally blind. And then we pair that blind auditor with a sighted auditor. And that's how we ensure we're covering the full disability spectrum. Because a really critical point there that a lot of people don't think about is, okay, like you have people who are blind, and I get that. They have to use, a screen reader to navigate with my site or use my site or, engage with my brand. But you also have a lot of other disabilities. You have, for example, physical disabilities. You could have someone who has, for example, spina bifida, or even, someone who was a war veteran, and because of their war injuries, they lost their hands and limbs, and they cannot control a mouse. So they use what we call keyboard-only navigation, essentially using 4 to 6 key commands on a website to go through. So by pairing those two auditors together, we are covering the full disability spectrum. We're covering 100% of that success criteria, because in our mind, where we come from, 33% compliant, to your point, Rachel, is not good enough. In fact, it's not even close.
Having a wheelchair ramp that's only 33% built, and then you're like,
Right.
go to the restaurant.
Great
and
point.
It doesn't really work that way. Let me ask you a question. So obviously it's good business. It's the right thing to do. There's a moral reason to being accessible. And I know you're going to talk about the financial reasons in a second and like the potential ROI, but going back to the lawsuits, and Ryan, you and I talked about this like a year ago, so the laws may have changed. But my understanding is there's a few things, because I have really small businesses that come to me and say, oh my gosh, I can't afford to be accessible. And I'll say to them, you're probably fine. You probably don't need to be, if it's, this maybe isn't the investment you need to make right now. So can you just break down and I know that the law is gray. I know that there's these quote unquote ambulance chasers, but there's certain industries that are more susceptible to needing to be compliant than others. So let's just talk about that a second, if you can.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So from that perspective, we see, and this is fairly common knowledge to us in the industry, we see a few industry verticals as by far the most heavily targeted from a Title III perspective. So that's where we start to get into
what the titles are, because I don't think most people know.
Yeah. So no, that's a great clarification point. So Title II organizations would be anyone who receives government funding, as a general, really simple way to think about it. So government agencies, state Secretary of State websites, procurement systems within the government, voter registration, things like that, or healthcare. So any healthcare organization that accepts Medicaid or Medicare, and then beyond that, the most common one is education. So any public education institute that receives any sort of government funding is governed by what is called Section 508 compliance. So Title II organizations are governed by this actual compliance law that says they do have to be WCAG 2.0 AA compliant. Most of the lawsuits are not in that industry. So those organizations are many times proactively thinking about this per se. I don't want to give them too much credit, because a lot of them aren't. In fact, a lot lot of government sites, healthcare websites are some of the most inaccessible sites out there, which is interesting. And that actually,
and you get government grant money, technically you fall into this. But I think the reason we don't see lawsuits in this area is because the lawyers are going after the ones with big money, right?
Yep, precisely. No, and you're exactly right. So that's where, so those Title II organizations, a lot of times, just from what we've seen, do not get targeted. I mean, education started to during COVID, because you had students who living with disabilities couldn't sign up for classes. They couldn't, get a class schedule. They couldn't really engage with the website, couldn't register, et cetera. But generally speaking, we haven't seen a lot of lawsuits against Title II organizations. So those ones that in theory should be accessible but aren't, and they've just avoided them. And I think, Rachel, to your point, that's what kind of frustrates a lot of Title III organizations. So Title III would be anyone who is not, fitting under that. They aren't required by any really set law. And this is where it gets a little gray, to your point. Absolutely, it's gray in the sense of the ADA was written in 1990. In 1990, the internet did not exist. We didn't have e-commerce websites. We couldn't, log into a bank account. We couldn't deposit checks via our phone. We couldn't do all that digital access stuff in 1990. The ADA has not been amended since then. What was that?
You were so old fashioned. I was just in the process of depositing a check as you were speaking.
Love it.
Love it. So you're right. It's changed so much. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it has. And the ADA hasn't been amended since 1990. What the ADA says is places of public accommodation have to be equally accessible to people with disabilities. That's where, to me, when I hear that, that isn't gray. And I'm not just saying that because I'm in the accessibility space. I believe my teammates, my, co-employees here that are living with disabilities, if I can deposit my check online, if I can log into a bank account, they absolutely should be able to. That's equitable access. And that's where these cases have been green-lighted by courts in the sense of, yes, I think it's kind of hard to argue that in this digital world, especially in the world that we live in today, and it's growing, it's expanding, as you guys well know, it's hard to argue that equitable access doesn't include the digital environment. So, but there's not anything set that says you have to be WCAG 2.1 AA compliant. There's just all of this case law and all of these lawsuits out there. That's where I think Title II organizations do get frustrated, and I understand it. You have all of these Title III, you have all of these Title II organizations that don't get targeted, but then you have these verticals, roundabout way to answer your question, Rachel. The most highly targeted verticals are most of these B2C environments. The most common one is, a vast amount of the lawsuits are in retail and e-commerce. So, e-commerce sites, and then rolling into things like financial institutions. So mortgage companies, credit unions, banks, probably the second most heavily targeted vertical, especially over the last year. And then historically speaking, COVID did slow this down. So the plaintiff firms did do a little positive act in not targeting businesses that were really hit by COVID. They've started to ramp that up significantly again now. But hospitality and hospitality and casual dining. So fast casual, those, hospitality and dining were the second and third most heavily targeted verticals historically, and that's starting to come back now.
So my general rule, and I'm not an attorney, so Brian, tell me but is if your website is going to influence how somebody interacts with your product or service, then you're in kind of that zone of needing to be compliant. What I mean by that is, for example, e-commerce, absolutely. If you're going to buy something online, that's an interaction. Looking at samples, that's an interaction. Downloading, definitely the career section on any website is a liability.
Yep.
Then, sometimes when I see, and again, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not making any claims. But my attorney likes to tell me anybody can sue you for anything. So keep that in mind.
Yep.
But, if you're a professional service, for example, you might be in a safer category because if you're just sharing information like a blog post, they're not physically interacting with your product or service on the website, and that's kind of a very, very gray area, but that's kind of the difference I see in the danger zone. Would you agree with that or disagree?
Yeah, so this is, I'll toe a fine line. I think that's a phenomenal question. I'll toe a fine line in saying, in actually agreeing with you, any organization can be targeted. So I don't want, because I'm not going to go out there and say, hey, if you're a professional service, you won't get targeted, because we certainly see it, but you're much, again, I'm going to base this off facts and stats only. You're much less likely to get targeted, historically speaking, based on all of the historical lawsuits that are out there and all the data you can pull, than someone who is selling products online, or someone who is allowing someone to engage with an actual product or service that is physically online or digitally online, versus someone who maybe. And I'll try to think about this in an easy way, like a carpet cleaner. I don't know. That's the first thing that popped in my head. It might be a terrible example, but a carpet cleaner, I probably don't really do much on their site. Unless they have like a booking agent, or I can, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be accessible, and I'm not saying they won't get sued, because my belief is they should be accessible. Someone who has a disability should be able to find their information and about their services just like I can. But purely speaking, from a legal perspective, and again, I am not a lawyer either, based on stats, yes, probably less likely to get targeted. Someone can probably call and consume with that organization. just as easy as they could online. Especially a really small business, because they might have, Rachel, you know this better than probably I do. They might have 5 templates in 5 pages, and it might literally be, here's about our family story, and here's our phone number, and here's our one location. And so, that it could be as simple as that. And I would have to call to really consume with them, from a holistic perspective. So yeah, I think based on the data and the stats, absolutely less likely to be targeted than someone who is actually, selling something online. And to your point, a lot of those e-commerce and retail organizations, they don't even, and even mortgage companies, insurance companies nowadays, they don't even have physical locations.
Yeah.
That's in the past. I mean, how many e-commerce brands do we all engage with that they aren't in stores? They do not have a store. So in that sense, your website is your location.
Right. You've got to make it. So let me ask you this. We know that obviously it's the right thing to do. And there can be right morally, and compliance will also hopefully prevent us from being on the receiving end of any lawsuits or being targeted. But beyond that, when it comes specifically to ROI, meaning, and I'm talking specifically about, hey, somebody who has a disability is able to access your website, and maybe it's one of the few in your industry or in your geographic area that they can. What is the revenue opportunity that presents itself when you are ADA compliant online?
So I love that question, and that's actually something. I was on a call with one of our blind auditors the other day, supporting a client. So answering some client questions, actually going through their site and showing them. So this is an ironic example, because the client, I'll go down this dovetail because I think it's interesting. And I think it does kind of point to your answer to your question. So this client is a very high visibility e-commerce brand. We've all heard of them. We've probably all shopped on their site. We were on the call with them. They were like, look, we've ran. What's that?
Amazon.
It's not Amazon. No, not quite that big.
I feel like Amazon really has
that would be.
You're my hero.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great if I was talking to Amazon, because I love Amazon too.
Put that out there.
But anyways, so the client had run. I think the number was, and don't quote me. I think they had run 3 scanning tools, and they showed us the reports, 0 errors. They had run free tools, paid tools, and we were like, okay, that's great. Our blind auditor, the point of that call was to show them the importance of having someone with a disability actually test their site. He goes on their site, he pulls up his screen reader, he could not use the search functionality, he could not use their menu, he could not find a product. I had to send him a direct link to a product. So there's number one. I mean, he was excluded basically out of the box. On that product page, he could not pick a size, a color, and could not add something to the cart. So as a blind individual, all these automated tools were telling them you're fully accessible. Blind person goes on, he could not engage with their brand at all. Obviously, arms went up and everyone started to panic, and it was like, okay, like we see the value in it.
Exactly.
Yeah, hopefully that's coming. But where I was going with that, Kerry, is I think that's such a phenomenal question, is where we are at today. And this is, I believe this very, very strongly, not just because we've worked with thousands of clients, but just what I see holistically in the environment is, yes, that was a big e-commerce brand, but there's a lot of other brands that I know their site is compliant that sell very similar things. So if you're someone living with a disability, where I think we are at today, and this answer would have been very different 5 years ago, and that's a very, very good thing, that's a very positive thing, is there is enough compliant sites on the internet now that people who are living with a disability don't have to feel excluded. They don't have to be excluded from engaging or purchasing or having equitable access to something. So to your point, if your site isn't accessible, they will find a competitor. They'll find a similar service. They'll find another e-commerce site that is selling something that is compliant that they can actually shop on, check out on, engage with that brand. And that's where their business and their money will go.
So Ryan and I did a webinar. Oh my gosh, Ryan! Now that I just pulled up the file. It was like pre-COVIDia. There was a really cool slide on that webinar. We'll selflessly plug that in a little bit. But I'm just going to look at a couple of these stats. So 19% of the U.S. population has a disability. That's 56 million people. 1 in 10 men are colorblind. So we don't even think about colorblind. My brother's colorblind, for example. He can't read something like yellow font on a blue background, cannot read, or anything even close to that.
Yep.
1 in 3 U.S. families have at least one member in them with a disability. But here's the thing. People with disability have 544 billion with a B dollars in spending power every year. Like, how much money are you leaving on the table? And like, if we're only going to talk about this in dollars and cents, you know, it's a good business decision to do this. I'm trying to think if there's any other really cool stats that we want to look at. But, and then just for, as I'm looking at this, there's kind of 4 areas that people fall in with disabilities. And there's hundreds now, probably, Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, different devices. It's just like there's a bazillion different versions of the iPhone. Yeah, a ton of different devices. So it's becoming more and more challenging for these tools to keep up so that everyone can view it. But the 4 categories are visual, cognitive, physical, and auditory. So again, but I think the big point here is that the buying power is astronomical, and you're missing an opportunity if you're not making your site ADA compliant. Right? Would you agree with that?
Precisely, yeah. And I think, you know, that's I'm glad you pulled those stats up, Rachel. That is really phenomenal, and something we share all the time is like, I think personally, not just because I live in this industry and I see it and I hear horror stories from some of our employees, but I think people with disabilities get put in a box and kind of shoved in the corner a lot. And that's not okay. That's not okay from my perspective, really from many people's perspective, and really A360's perspective. But I think and that's where I go back to one of the things I said earlier. I think it's so much, and your ramp example was so phenomenal. I'm absolutely going to steal that, just as an FYI. But I think it's so
visual.
It's actually kind of a funny but terrible visual of like,
but you get it. That's why it's so horrifying. You know, it's easy to see what that looks like physically. It's harder a little bit to imagine what it would be like if you're.
What's the point? What's the point of being 33% done? It's kind of like, I'm going to build this bridge 33% of the way.
Yeah.
Precisely. And I think, you know, like most of the things that our clients fix after we do an audit, they're not seen by someone who doesn't have a disability. It's, you know, that's one of the biggest myths that we talk about all the time is like, well, if we have an audit done, if we make our site compliant, it's going to be ugly. You're going to make us change our branding. We work, you know, with many of the leading celebrities in their cosmetic sites. I mean, we are not telling them to, you know, kill their brand and change their colors. They would never do that. But the reality is a lot of this is in the underlying code. So to your example, it's such an easy one and a great way to think about this is like you can physically see a lot of physical access barriers, a lot of digital access barriers. They're not seen, you know, screen reader only text or things that make a site accessible to someone who is blind and going through a site with a screen reader. They're not seen by someone in theory that doesn't have a disability. It's all in the underlying code. So it's sort of like, well, okay, they can't use it, but like, you know, looks fine to me and it works fine for me. So yeah, that spending power thing is so powerful in that sense. In fact, you know, to your question, Kerry, it's such a good one. You know, where we are at today, there are enough brands that are doing this for the right reason. And I know people will say, well, everyone does this because they could get sued. And that's just not true. I mean, I talk to you know, tons of organizations every single week, and there are a lot of organizations that are like, look, this is the right thing to do. We're at this point where like, this has to be included. And to that point, a lot of people living with disabilities, if they are excluded from a site, we are slowly getting to that place where they can find another brand, another organization, another service provider that does provide equitable access, and they'll just spend their money there, to your point, Rachel.
Yeah, so let's not have them do that. With that said, we're coming up on the end of the episode, Ryan, and I have absorbed a ton of great information, and I know our audience has as well. Now we want to give them the opportunity to learn some weird fact or the craziest thing that ever happened to you. So what is the weirdest thing that ever happened to you? Have you had time to think about it?
I have. So I'll call it the most, I don't know if it's the weirdest, but I'll call it the most awkward scenario that I ever had. So in college, I worked for the University of Minnesota. I was actually a student manager with the basketball team. We went on a road trip to Iowa from Minnesota. We flew there. We got there, and I was one of my roles was obviously to make sure everything got there. That's one of our core roles as a student manager. We get on the road and we have all of our gear. We forgot in Minneapolis all of our coaches' luggage. So at that time, our head coach was Tubby Smith, a Hall of Fame coach. We had 6 coaches, I think. We go to unload the bus, and the coaches were all looking at us, and we're like, like you can tell the look on their face. And Coach Smith and 5 other coaches didn't have luggage for a 3-day road trip, and one of us actually had to drive from Iowa City back to Minneapolis to overnight to pick up their luggage. So it was one of the most awkward. I wanted to crawl in a hole and, not be seen for like a week because it was pretty bad. If we're going to forget somebody, like forget our stuff, not the head coaches and everybody else's. So I don't know. Does that fit the bill? Is there anything better I could explain?
I have all sorts. Well, I'll keep it to a minimum. They couldn't just go to Target and pick some shit up.
Well, we had to be in we had deals with like Nike, so everything had to be branded. We couldn't be out in, I think they did end up going in.
Do they have no Nike stores in all of Iowa?
Well, they probably do, but we had to have team branded gear. So it wasn't pretty. It was, I think they went and got some clothes. Like we had some extra clothes to wear, but not really like game day clothes and suits and, shoes. And it wasn't fun.
That's mortifying.
Is that good enough? Can I get something
great.
better? I'm trying to think.
So I feel obligated to share a story since we mentioned, we were talking about people who are colorblind. You guys are going to think I'm a terrible person, but I was very young.
Too late.
Too late. You're already there. So I mentioned my brother's colorblind, which, he's incredibly successful in finance because I guess creative is not where he wants to be. But when he was little, do you know how you have to do the paint by numbers? So for example, in school, when you have to do math, and then if the answer is 5, you paint this part of the picture blue and
red or whatever. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So because he was colorblind and there were always primary colors that they used to come in. And I mean, I think I was mad at him for some reason. I mean, he was 6, I was 7 or 8. And he's like, Rachel, what color is this? I told him all the wrong colors to cover his picture.
You're such an asshole.
I know, I'm a terrible person. I still feel bad about that. I'm going to have to send him something, but
send him
so that's one of the weirdest things I've ever done. And it also shows my truly cruel side. I think he stole a Barbie or something. He probably deserved it. I'm just
did. Hung her upside down, chopped her head off.
Definitely. So Ron, with that, so I'm going to shamelessly plug, this webinar that Ryan and I did a year ago. It was targeted to nonprofits and why they want to be accessible and what they need to do and giving some really good information on next steps. So that's on our website, paradigm-md.com, and it's under our on-demand webinar. So go check that out. But Ryan, why don't you tell everybody where they can find more information about you, your company, all that good stuff?
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate it. So pretty straightforward, accessible without a Y. So accessible360.com. Everybody calls this accessibility360. That's the obvious thing to search, but no, it is just plainly accessible360, 360.com. You can find everything, reach out to us at info@accessible360.com. You can send me an email if I could help, on anything. That's one of the things, Rachel, I think, about us. We are happy to have a conversation, even if it's just exploratory. If we can support even the little guy, we want to do it. We believe in equitable access, and we have very, very lofty missions and visions here at A360 of a fully accessible internet. Obviously, that's very broad. Most of the internet in the U.S. today is not accessible. In fact, the vast majority of it isn't. But, we are striving for that every single day. And so we are happy to have a conversation. I'm happy to have a conversation. My direct email is pretty simple, Ryan, RYAN @accessible360.com.
You are fantastic. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me.
Absolutely. A thrill and a pleasure to learn from you. For our audience, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Mavens of Marketing. We will see you back here next week, same time, same place. Until then. It's a teaser. Coming up on the next episode of the Mavens of Marketing, we have super connector media PR master Jen Gottlieb. She's going to be talking to you about everything you need to know when it comes to expanding and leveraging your visibility for additional exposure opportunities. Plus, she shares with us the weirdest thing that ever happened to her as the host of an MTV show. Stick around.